The first thing I heard that morning was the sound of my barn collapsing. Not creaking, not cracking. Collapsing. A deep, violent roar rolled across my property just after sunrise, followed by the sharp snapping of timber and the grinding scream of metal. I ran out of my farmhouse barefoot, still wearing the same gray t-shirt and work pants I'd slept in. Then I saw it. My red barn, the barn my grandfather had built with his own hands, was disappearing behind a cloud of dust. An excavator was tearing through the eastern wall, and standing beside it, smiling like she'd just won the lottery, was the president of our HOA, Karen Whitmore. She was 48 years old, perfectly styled, wearing a cream-colored blazer over a white blouse, black designer pants, polished brown riding boots, and oversized sunglasses. Her blonde hair was pulled into the same tight shoulder-length bob she wore to every HOA meeting. She looked at me over the top of her sunglasses. "Good morning," she called. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. "What the hell are you doing?" Karen smiled. "Removing an unauthorized structure." I looked at the excavator, then at my barn, then back at her. "You have 5 seconds to get that machine off my property." She laughed. That laugh would stay in my head for years. "Your barn is gone forever?" she said. "You should have listened when the OA warned you." The excavator's bucket slammed into another support beam. The roof groaned, and my grandfather's barn began to fall. I ran toward it. A man in a yellow safety vest stepped in front of me. "Sir, stay back! That's my property!" Karen folded her arms. "Actually, it's HOA-regulated property." "No," I said. "It isn't." She tilted her head. "You're gonna learn something today." I didn't know it yet, but Karen was about to make the most expensive mistake of her life. Because she thought she was destroying an illegal barn. What she was actually destroying was evidence. And less than 3 weeks later, a judge would look her directly in the eyes and ask one question that would change everything. But that morning, I knew none of that. All I knew was that my family's barn was being destroyed. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 41 years old, and I'd spent most of my life on the 12-acre property my grandfather left me outside a growing Texas town. The property sat at the end of a long gravel road surrounded by pasture, cedar trees, and old wooden fencing. My farmhouse was modest, white siding, a metal roof, a wraparound porch. But the land behind it was what mattered to me. My cattle were there. My 2 horses were there. And that red barn had been there longer than almost every house in the subdivision that now surrounded us. The subdivision had been built 15 years earlier. The developers called it a luxury ranch community. I called it a neighborhood that had slowly crept toward my fence line. When the first houses went up, nobody bothered me. Then the HOA arrived. At first it was harmless. They complained about the color of my mailbox. Then the gravel driveway. Then the wooden fence. Then my hay trailer. Eventually, they decided they didn't like my barn. That was when Karen became obsessed with me. She claimed the barn violated the community's architectural standards. I reminded her that my property existed before the subdivision. She said that didn't matter. I showed her my deed. She said the HOA had jurisdiction. I showed her the county records. She said I was being difficult. Then I showed her the original subdivision plat. She stopped smiling. For the first time, I saw something behind her eyes, fear, but it lasted only a second. She recovered quickly. "Enjoy your barn while you can," she'd told me at the last OA meeting. I thought it was an empty threat. I was wrong. Now, standing in the dust that morning, I watched a second excavator move toward the barn. "You're trespassing," I shouted. Karen didn't even look worried. "We have authorization." "From who?" She held up a folder. "The HOA Architectural Enforcement Committee." I walked toward her. "That's not a government authority." She smiled. "We don't need to be the government." "Then you don't have the right to touch my property." Karen stepped closer. "You signed this HOA agreement." "I never signed an agreement giving you permission to demolish my buildings." "You accepted the covenants." "The covenants don't say you can destroy someone's property." She lowered her sunglasses. "You really should have hired a lawyer." I stared at her. "Maybe you should have." Her smile disappeared. Behind her, the excavator operator started the engine again. I turned toward the barn. "Stop!" The machine moved. I grabbed my phone and started recording. That decision saved me. The bucket punched through the barn doors. The old red paint exploded into splinters. My grandfather's workbench vanished beneath falling boards. I could see the metal shelves where I'd stored tools for 20 years collapse under the weight of the roof. I stood there frozen. There were things inside that barn that could never be replaced. My grandfather's saddle, his hand-forged branding irons, photographs, old tools, a wooden rocking chair he'd made for my mother, and in a small metal box beneath the workbench were letters he'd written to my grandmother when he was serving overseas decades earlier. I had spent years telling myself I'd preserve that barn forever. Karen destroyed it in less than 10 minutes. My neighbor Tom Alvarez came running from across the road. Tom was 63 and had lived nearby almost as long as my family had owned the property. He stared at the wreckage. "Daniel..." I couldn't answer. Tom looked at Karen. "You can't do this." Karen turned toward him. "This is HOA enforcement." Tom shook his head. "That's not HOA enforcement. That's criminal trespass." Karen's face hardened. "Watch yourself, Tom." He pointed toward my phone, is recording everything. "I know." She actually smiled again. That scared me more than anything. Because she wasn't acting like someone who thought she might be wrong. She was acting like someone who believed she couldn't lose. Then a sheriff's SUV appeared at the end of the gravel road. Karen looked toward it. Her smile widened. "Perfect." I thought the sheriff had come because Tom had called. But when Deputy Harris stepped out, Karen walked toward him like they were old friends. "Deputy, thank you for coming." I approached them. "Officer, she's destroying my property." Deputy Harris looked at the collapsed barn, then at Karen. "Ms. Whitmore says the structure was authorized for removal." I held up my phone. "I have the entire thing on video." Karen interrupted. "Daniel has been warned repeatedly about the structure. It's my barn." Deputy Harris sighed. "Sir, this looks like a civil dispute." I could barely control my anger. "She brought heavy equipment onto my land." "I understand." She destroyed my building." "I understand. Then arresting her isn't a civil matter." He didn't answer. Karen stood behind him, quietly smiling. Then something caught my eye. A white county pickup had stopped farther up the road. Two men stepped out. One of them was carrying a clipboard. The other was holding a rolled-up survey map. They weren't HOA employees. They weren't deputies. They were county surveyors. And they weren't looking at Karen. They were looking at my property line. The older surveyor walked toward me.
"Mr. Mercer, yes."
He glanced at the barn, then at Karen. "Who authorized this demolition?" Karen immediately stepped forward. "The HOA?" The surveyor frowned. "That's not what I asked." Karen's expression changed, just slightly. The surveyor unrolled the map across the hood of the county truck. "Mr. Mercer, when was this barn built?" "About 30 years before the subdivision." "Do you have the original property survey?"
"Yes."
"Good." He pointed to a line on the map. "Because according to the county's recorded plat, your barn sits approximately 22 feet outside the OA's jurisdiction." Nobody spoke. Even Deputy Harris looked surprised. Karen stepped closer. "That's impossible." The surveyor looked at her. "No, ma'am. What's impossible is how the HOA obtained an enforcement authorization for a structure that isn't inside the HOA-controlled area." Karen's face went pale. I looked at the ruins of my barn, then at the woman who had ordered its destruction. And for the first time that morning, Karen wasn't smiling. She was staring at the survey map. "That's not the correct plat," she whispered. The surveyor rolled the map back up. It came directly from the county records office. Karen turned toward me. Her voice was suddenly quiet. "Daniel." I raised my phone. "You should probably stop talking." She stared at the camera, then at the destroyed barn, then back at me. And that's when she made her second mistake. She pointed at the rubble and said, "Fine, if the HOA made a mistake, we'll rebuild it." I almost laughed. "You'll rebuild it?"
"Yes, exactly as it was."
"Of course." I looked at the county surveyor. He shook his head. "Mrs. Whitmore, you may want legal counsel before you make any more statements." Karen ignored him. She stepped toward me. "You wanted to fight, Daniel?" "No," I said. I looked at the remains of my grandfather's barn. "You started one." As she got into her black Mercedes SUV and drove away. The excavator crews followed. The sheriff left. The county surveyors stayed. Tom stood beside me in silence. Dust slowly settled over the pasture. A single piece of red painted wood lay on the ground near my boots. I picked it up. It was part of the old barn door. On the back, faded almost beyond recognition, were 3 words my grandfather had carved when he built it: Mercer family property. I held those words in my hand, and I made myself a promise. Karen Whitmore thought she had just destroyed my barn. She had no idea she just handed me the strongest evidence I could ever have asked for. And before this was over, every person who had helped her would have to explain exactly why they thought they could erase my family's property rights with an excavator. By noon, the dust had settled. The anger hadn't. I stood in the middle of what used to be my barn, staring at broken beams, twisted roofing, shattered boards, and pieces of my grandfather's life scattered across the dirt. Tom helped me search through the wreckage. We found the branding irons. We found the saddle. We found the wooden chair. The metal box was gone. My stomach dropped, Daniel. Tom said quietly, "Maybe it's buried." We searched for another hour. Nothing. Then I noticed something half buried beneath a collapsed section of wall. A small black security camera. It had been mounted near the barn entrance for years. I pulled it out of the dirt. The lens was cracked. But the memory card was still inside. I stared at it. Tom grinned. "Please tell me that thing was recording." I didn't answer. I ran toward the farmhouse. My hands were shaking as I connected the camera to my laptop. The screen flickered. Then the footage appeared. 6:41 a.m. The first excavator entered through my eastern gate, 6043. Karen Whitmore stepped onto my property, 6:45. She handed the operator document, 6047. The demolition began. I watched the footage twice. Then I noticed something I hadn't seen in person. At 6044, Karen handed a second document to a man standing beside her. The man wore a dark blue jacket. I recognized him immediately. Greg Lawson, the HOA's attorney. He wasn't supposed to be there, and he wasn't supposed to be authorizing anything. Tom leaned closer to the screen. "That's Lawson." "Yeah. Does he know the barn isn't in the HOA?" "He should." Tom looked at me. "Then why would he authorize the demolition?" I didn't know. But I was about to find out. I called a property attorney in town named Rebecca Shaw. I'd never met her before, but 3 different people had recommended her. She answered on the 4th ring. "Ms. Shaw, this is Rebecca. My name is Daniel Mercer. I have a property dispute with my HOA." There was a pause. "How serious?" I looked through the window toward the demolished barn. "Serious enough that they brought an excavator onto my property." The silence on the other end lasted longer this time. "Did they actually demolish something?" "My barn." "Do you have proof?" "Video." "Don't send it to anyone yet." "Why?" "Because if this is what you say it is, you may have more leverage than you realize." She asked me to come to her office. I drove into town in my old dark green Ford F-250. The truck was covered in dust from the demolition. I didn't wash it. I wanted the evidence exactly where it was. Rebecca's office was in a brick building across from the courthouse. She was 45, with dark brown hair cut just below her shoulders, brown eyes, and a calm expression that made you feel like she had already seen every disaster imaginable. She watched the video without saying a word. When it ended, she leaned back. Play it again. I did. When it ended the second time, she paused on the frame showing Greg Lawson handing Karen the document. That's important. Why? Because an HOA attorney generally doesn't have authority to authorize the physical destruction of someone's property. That's what I thought. She nodded. No, let's talk about your property. I handed her my deed. She studied it, then I gave her the county plat. She compared the two documents. Her expression changed. Daniel, who told the HOA this barn was inside their jurisdiction? I don't know. Did you ever receive a formal notice of demolition? No. An eviction order? No. Any court order authorizing entry onto your property? No. She looked up. Then why did they think they could do this? Because Karen believes the HOA owns the world. Rebecca almost smiled. That's not a legal doctrine. She pulled another document from the folder. There's something else. What? She pointed to the property description. The eastern boundary of your parcel is different from what appears in the HOA's enforcement map. Meaning someone may have been using an altered map? My heart started pounding. Could that be intentional? It could. She stood. Where's the original county survey? At home, get it. I drove back. By the time I returned, Rebecca was already examining it. She spread the survey across her conference table. The property boundary was unmistakable. The barn wasn't 22 feet outside the HOA. It was 38 feet outside it. Rebecca stared at the measurement. That's worse. For them. For whoever authorized the demolition. She picked up her phone. I'm calling the county recorder. While she spoke, I sat there staring at the map. Then my phone buzzed. A message from Karen. I opened it. It contained a photograph. It was a picture of the destroyed barn. Underneath it were 6 words. This is what happens when you resist. I showed Rebecca. She didn't react emotionally. She simply said, don't respond. Then her phone rang. It was the county recorder. Rebecca listened for nearly 2 minutes. When she hung up, she looked directly at me. Daniel, I need you to understand something. What? The county has 2 different versions of the property plat. My stomach tightened. What? One is the official recorded version, and the other, an HOA submission from 11 months ago. What does it show? She turned the paper around. The second map showed the HOA boundary extending across my barn. Someone had moved the boundary line, not by a few inches, by nearly 40 feet. I stared at it. Who submitted it? The AOA. Karen, her name isn't on the filing. Then who? Rebecca pointed to the signature. Greg Lawson, the HOA attorney. The same man standing beside Karen while my barn was demolished. For the first time since that morning, my anger became something different. It became focused. I wasn't just dealing with an arrogant HOA president anymore. I was dealing with a coordinated effort. Someone had apparently changed a property map, then used that map to justify destroying my building. Rebecca folded her arms. There's another problem for them. What? Your barn may have had historical value. I looked at her. It was built in the 1980s. Not officially historical. But you have records showing your grandfather constructed it before the subdivision existed. She pulled out her notebook. That matters because the HO can't simply claim that its rules automatically override pre-existing property rights. So what do? We file for emergency relief. Against Karen, against the HOA, the board members involved, and anyone else who participated. I nodded. Do it. She studied me. This won't be cheap. I don't care. It could become very expensive. I looked at the photograph of my barn lying in ruins. They already made it expensive. That evening, I returned home just before sunset. The property felt strangely quiet. My cattle stood near the far fence. The horses were restless, and the empty space where the barn had stood looked like a missing tooth. Then I noticed something. There were tire tracks behind the ruins, not from the excavators, smaller, SUV tires. Someone had returned after the demolition. I followed the tracks. They led toward the old storage shed behind the barn. The door was open. I stopped. I hadn't left it open. I stepped inside. Nothing appeared missing. Then I saw the dirt floor near the back wall. Fresh footprints. Someone had been digging. I crouched down. The dirt looked recently disturbed. I grabbed a shovel. After a few minutes, the blade struck metal. My heart jumped. I dug faster. A small metal box appeared, the same kind my grandfather used for important documents. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. The lock had been broken. Inside were papers, old letters, photographs, and one folded document that made me stop breathing. It was a handwritten agreement dated 28 years earlier. My grandfather had apparently negotiated an access easement with the original developer before the subdivision was ever built. The agreement granted my property a protected agricultural access corridor. The corridor ran directly through the area where the HOA had claimed jurisdiction. I read the final paragraph 3 times. Then I called Rebecca. She answered immediately. Daniel, I found something. What? I think I found the reason they wanted the barn gone. What did you find? I told her about the easement. There was silence. Then she said, don't move. What? Don't touch anything else. Why? Because if that agreement is authentic, the HOA's entire position may be much worse than we thought. I looked toward the darkness outside. How much worse? Her voice became serious. Daniel, if the easement is valid, they may not only have destroyed your property. She paused. They may have destroyed the physical structure, protecting their own legal obligations. I looked back at the empty doorway. Explain. The corridor may give you rights over part of the land they developed. I couldn't speak. The houses surrounding my ranch suddenly looked different. For years, I had thought the HOA was slowly taking control of my property. But maybe the truth was the opposite. Maybe my grandfather had protected that land long before the first OA board member ever existed. And maybe Karen had demolished my barn because someone discovered what was inside it. I barely slept that night. At 20:17 a.m. my phone rang. It was Rebecca. "Daniel, I just received something from the county." "What? An old survey?" "From when?" 30 years ago. "What does it show?" Her voice was unusually tense. "It shows the subdivision was built around your original agricultural corridor." I sat up in bed. "That means—" She interrupted me. "It means the HOA may have been violating your grandfather's recorded rights for years." I stared into the darkness. Then another message appeared on my phone. This one wasn't from Karen, it was from an unknown number. The message contained a single photograph. A picture of Karen Whitmore standing beside Greg Lawson. Behind them was the county records office. And beneath the photograph was one sentence: "They changed more than the map." I stared at the screen. Someone had been watching them. And whoever it was knew exactly what Karen and her attorney had done. But I had no idea who had sent the message. The next morning, Rebecca told me something even more disturbing. The county had scheduled an emergency meeting, and Karen Whitmore had requested it herself. She wasn't backing down. She was preparing to accuse me publicly of fraud, trespassing, and violating HOA restrictions. She thought she could turn the entire neighborhood against me before the truth came out. But she had made one mistake. She didn't know about the old easement, and she didn't know that Rebecca had already found another document buried in the county archives. A document bearing my grandfather's signature. And the signature of the man who originally developed the entire neighborhood. That document contained a clause that could potentially cost the HOA millions. Karen was about to discover that destroying my barn had not erased the evidence. It had exposed it. And when I walked into that emergency HOA meeting the following evening, I wasn't walking in as the man whose barn had been destroyed. I was walking in with the original property records under my arm. And Karen Whitmore was about to learn that the one thing she couldn't demolish was the truth. The HOA emergency meeting was held in a clubhouse that looked more like a country club than a neighborhood meeting hall. By the time I arrived, nearly 100 residents were packed inside. Karen Whitmore stood at the front beside Greg Lawson. She looked completely different from the woman I'd seen standing beside my demolished barn. She was composed, confident, prepared. A projector displayed a photograph of my barn with the words, "You now so as a mouse tirutuar, Ramumbo Crevide." I almost laughed. They had already decided the verdict. Karen tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. Unfortunately, we've been forced to address a serious violation involving Mr. Daniel Mercer." A few residents looked toward me. Sumper Tom walked in behind me. Rebecca followed. Karen's expression tightened when she saw her. "Mr. Mercer has repeatedly refused to comply with HOA regulations," Karen continued. "Despite multiple notices, he maintained an unauthorized agricultural structure that posed safety and property value concerns." I raised my hand. Karen ignored me. "He has now threatened members of the board and attempted to intimidate our contractors." Tom muttered, "She's unbelievable." Karen continued, "For everyone's safety, the board authorized removal of the structure." Rebecca leaned toward me. "Let her finish." I nodded. Karen clicked the remote. The next slide appeared. It showed a map, the altered map, the one where the HOA boundary had been moved across my property. "This clearly shows the barn was inside the regulated area," Rebecca whispered. Now I stood. "Can I ask a question?" Karen sighed dramatically. "This isn't a courtroom." "No," I said. "But you're about to wish it were." The room went quiet. I walked toward the front. Karen stepped away from the microphone. "You've had your opportunity." "No. You had yours." I placed the original county survey on the table, then the recorded plat, then the old easement agreement. Finally, I placed a certified copy of the county's official boundary record beside them. "Your map is fake." The room erupted. Karen's face turned red. "That's an outrageous accusation." Rebecca stepped forward. "We have certified county records proving the HOA submitted an altered boundary map 11 months ago." Greg Lawson immediately objected. "That document is irrelevant." Rebecca looked at him. "You signed it." The room went silent. Greg's face changed. Karen looked at him. He looked back at her. For the first time, they weren't standing together. They were looking for somewhere to hide. I picked up the old easement. "This was recorded before your subdivision existed." Karen shook her head. "That doesn't prove anything. It proves you knew this corridor existed." Greg interrupted. "Misty Mercer, you don't understand the legal significance of." "I understand enough." I held up another document. "This is the developer's original agreement with my grandfather." Karen stopped breathing for a moment. The document showed that the developer had agreed to preserve my agricultural access corridor permanently. And there was something else. A compensation clause. If the developer or any successor organization interfered with that corridor, the property owner could seek damages based on the cost of restoration and consequential losses. Rebecca looked at the crowd. That clause was incorporated into the recorded development documents. A resident near the back stood up. "Does that mean the HOA knew about it?" Rebecca answered calmly. "The records indicate the OA received copies of these documents years ago." Another resident spoke. "Then why did they demolish the barn?" Nobody answered. Karen finally grabbed the microphone. "Because the barn was still unauthorized." I looked at her. "You keep saying that." She pointed toward me. "It was never subject to your authority. You signed the covenants, not the way you claim." She turned toward the residents. He's manipulating these documents. Rebecca smiled slightly. No, Karen. She pulled out a folder of certified copies. Karen stared at her. Rebecca continued, and we have something else. She placed another document on the table. An internal HOA email. Karen's face went pale. I hadn't seen that document before. Rebecca opened it. The email had been sent by Greg Lawson to several board members 6 months earlier. It discussed the agricultural corridor. One sentence stood out. The old easement remains enforceable, so any action against Mercer's structures should be carefully considered. The room exploded. Karen turned toward Greg. You told me that was irrelevant. Greg's mouth opened. No words came out. The board members began arguing among themselves. One director stood up. I never approved this. Another shouted, you signed the enforcement order. I signed it because Karen said the county had confirmed the boundary. Karen screamed. Everyone knew about the barn. The room went completely silent. She had just admitted something. Rebecca looked at me. Then at Karen. You should probably stop talking. Karen realized her mistake. But it was too late. The sheriff's department had already received the video, and the county had already opened an investigation into the altered records. 2 days later, I received a call from Deputy Harris, Mimstreet. Mercer. Yes, I need you to come down to the station. My heart sank. What happened? Arrested someone?
Who? There was a pause.
One of the contractors involved in the demolition. I drove to the station. The contractor had apparently been questioned about the demolition authorization. He initially claimed the HOA had given him everything he needed. Then investigators showed him the county records. He changed his story. He admitted Karen had told him the property was part of the HOA, but then he revealed something I hadn't expected. The contractor had asked Karen for proof. She had provided the altered map, and Greg Lawson had personally told him that the HOA would handle any legal problems. The contractor also handed investigators a copy of the original demolition proposal. The estimated cost to rebuild my barn was already there, $12,000. The damage to the agricultural corridor, fencing equipment, livestock facilities, and lost operations could be calculated separately. But the biggest revelation came when investigators examined the HOA's financial records. The board had been planning to use a special assessment against the entire neighborhood to pay for a massive private road expansion. The project depended on using part of the agricultural corridor. My barn had been standing directly in the way. Karen didn't want my barn gone because it was ugly. She wanted the land underneath it. That was the real reason. My grandfather's property rights had become an obstacle to a multimillion-dollar development plan, and Karen had decided the easiest way to remove the obstacle was to pretend the obstacle didn't legally exist. A week later, Rebecca filed the lawsuit. The defendants included the HOA Karen Whitmore, Greg Lawson, several board members, and the companies involved in the demolition. The case exploded across the county. Neighbors who had ignored me for years suddenly started calling. Some apologized. Others brought me documents. One elderly resident gave Rebecca a box of old HOA newsletters. Another gave us meeting minutes from 12 years earlier. And then Tom found something even better. A former board member. Her name was Linda Foster. She had resigned from the HOA 3 years earlier. She agreed to meet us. We sat around her kitchen table. Linda looked exhausted. I knew Karen wanted that land, she said. I stared at her.
How long? Years?
Why didn't you tell anyone? She looked down, because I was afraid. Then she opened a drawer and removed a flash drive. I copied these before I resigned. Rebecca plugged it into her laptop. There were hundreds of files. Emails, budgets, meeting notes, private communications, and one folder labeled Demolished Part Y. Inside were photographs of my barn taken from different angles, maps, property records, and a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet listed projected profits from the road expansion. At the bottom was a note, barn must be removed before construction begins. There it was, the motive, the plan. The proof Karen hadn't made a mistake. She had planned it. The trial began months later. By then, the case had attracted local media attention. I didn't care about publicity. I cared about my grandfather. I wanted someone to explain why his life's work had been reduced to rubble. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Karen sat at the defense table in a dark navy suit, no sunglasses, no smirk, no confident smile. Greg Lawson sat beside her. Their attorneys tried to argue that the HOA had acted under a reasonable interpretation of the covenants. Rebecca dismantled that argument piece by piece. She presented the original deed, the recorded plat, the easement, the developer agreement, the altered map, the security footage, the contractor's testimony, the internal emails, and finally the financial documents showing the proposed development. Then she played the video. The courtroom watched my barn collapse. Nobody spoke. The judge watched Karen standing beside the excavator. Then the video reached the moment when she smiled at me. Your barn is gone forever. The judge paused the recording. She looked across the courtroom. Mrs. Whitmore. Karen raised her head. Did you say that? Karen's attorney stood. My client was speaking figuratively. The judge looked at him. The recording speaks for itself. He sat down. Rebecca then presented the county surveyor. He explained exactly where the legal boundary was. Then the county records officer testified that the HOA had submitted a different map. The prosecutor asked, was the altered map the official county record? No. Was it ever valid? Then how was it used? The officer looked toward Karen. It was submitted as supporting documentation for HOA enforcement. Then the courtroom became silent. Then came the final witness, Linda Foster. She explained the development plan. She identified the spreadsheet. She explained why the barn had become an obstacle, and she testified that Karen had discussed getting rid of the Mercer problem months before the demolition. Karen's attorney objected repeatedly, but the documents were already admitted. The evidence was overwhelming. Still, nobody was prepared for the judge's final decision. The court found that the HOA had no authority to demolish my barn. The entry onto my property was unlawful. The altered map had been used to support the demolition. The HOA had knowingly interfered with my recorded property rights, and the defendants were responsible for the resulting damages. But then the judge turned to the question of restoration. The barn itself had to be rebuilt, not with cheap materials, not with some modern steel shed. The court ordered a full reconstruction consistent with the original structure. The agricultural corridor had to be restored. The damaged fencing had to be replaced. The equipment losses had to be compensated. The lost agricultural income had to be calculated. And because the demolition had been part of an intentional scheme connected to the planned development, the court awarded substantial additional damages. The final number appeared on the judgment. I stared at it. 6/17/8042. More than $6 million. Karen didn't move. Greg looked like he had aged 20 years. The HOA attorney leaned over and whispered something to Karen. She shook her head. Then the judge said something I'll never forget. Property rights do not disappear because someone has enough authority to sound convincing. The courtroom was silent. Then she continued, "An association is not a government, a board is not a court, and a private organization cannot manufacture jurisdiction by changing a map." Karen looked at me. For the first time, there was no arrogance in her eyes, only disbelief. After the hearing, she walked past me. She stopped. I thought she might apologize. Instead, she whispered, "You ruined everything." I looked at her. "No." I pointed toward the courthouse doors. "You did. The rebuilding took nearly a year. I hired craftsmen who understood old Texas barn construction. We reused whatever original wood could be safely preserved. The old red boards that survived the demolition were incorporated into the new structure. The wooden sign bearing my grandfather's words was restored. When the new barn was finally finished, Tom stood beside me. He looked around. "It's beautiful," I nodded. "It is." My cattle were moved back into the rebuilt stalls. My horses returned. And on the wall above my grandfather's restored workbench, I placed the 3 words he had carved decades earlier: Mercer family property. The HOA never recovered. Several board members resigned. Greg Lawson lost his position. Karen was removed as president. The planned road expansion collapsed, and the residents who had once applauded her began demanding answers about how their HO money had been spent. As for me, I stopped attending OA meetings. I had no reason to. My property was finally mine again. One evening, almost a year after the demolition, I stood outside the rebuilt barn at sunset. The sky was orange over the pasture. The horses were grazing. The wind moved through the cedar trees. I ran my hand across one of the original red boards. For a moment, I thought about that terrible morning. The excavator, the dust, Karen's smile, the sound of my grandfather's barn collapsing. Then I looked at the rebuilt structure. It wasn't exactly the same, nothing ever is, but it was standing, and so was I. Tom walked up behind me. "You ever think about selling?" I smiled. "Not a chance," he laughed. Good. We stood there watching the sunset. Then I noticed something nailed beneath the old wooden sign. It was a small brass plate. I had put it there myself. It contained only one sentence. Not for Karen. Not for the HOA. Not even for the judge. It was for my grandfather. It read, "They tore down the barn, but they never owned the land." And that became the lesson I carried with me. People can intimidate you. They can surround you with rules. They can wave official-looking papers. They can convince an entire neighborhood that they're right. But confidence isn't authority. A title isn't ownership. And a board vote doesn't erase the law. Karen Whitmore thought she was demolishing an old barn. Instead, she exposed an entire scheme, destroyed her own credibility, cost her HO millions, and rebuilt the very property she had sworn would never stand again. I looked at the red barn one last time as the sun disappeared behind the pasture. Then I smiled, because my grandfather's barn was standing again. And this time everyone knew exactly whose land it stood on: Mercer family property.